Welcome back to the EPS podcast, where everything is a primary source. I am Eric Paul, and today I'm joined by Andrew. Just like our very first full episode, I realize the first episode is a word about primary sources, but the very first episode that we recorded on breaking down a primary source was 1989's Batman. So welcome back.
Hey, everybody.
It's so nice to have you here. And honestly, I think there are some comparisons between Batman and what we're going to be talking about today. Different identities. And I've even had people talk. I've read a thing about how the character of Jay Gats does sound like a Batman villain. And I think may have been one, Gats like a gun. So what we're going to be talking about today is the cover art to 1925's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. So we're going to, of course, at some point or another, talk about the story itself. It's going to happen, but we're trying to focus our best on the design concepts and the graphic art of The Great Gatsby's iconic eyes. And so the celestial eyes painting. A few months ago, I was with my wife walking around town, and we looked into a bookstore window. The bookstore was closed, so it's just kind of taking a look through the window and see what they had on display. And I saw a book of The Great Gatsby, and it had a completely different cover. It was the grille of a 1920s car, and I know that cars play a major role in the storyline. They're almost characters in their own way in the Great Gatsby, but I couldn't help but say to myself, like, of all the covers in the world, I think that this one, the Francis Cugat painting, is one that can't be replaced. Do you feel the same way about this cover?
Yeah, it is weird that, like, I am. This goes against typically I love new stuff, and I like cover songs, and when someone takes something original and kind of mixes it up, I like that concept. But I think there are certain things that are sacred because of their meaning, and this is one of those things that, like, every time I've seen a new version of this cover, I've just been let down, because it feels like the goal is not to capture the meaning or connection with the novel, but more just to take basic elements of the novel, superficial understandings of the novel, and make it visually attractive so another person will want to pick it up. Or, for nerds like me who are constantly getting new editions of things, just to pick up yet another one. So for example, this kind of is a perfect time for this. The graphic novel version of this novel just came out. The past couple of years has been a lot of interest in taking classic literature and giving it a go, in the graphic novel form, because for years that had been kind of like, I don't know, almost like low humor. I remember as a kid watching the film Major League, and there's a great bit where Tom Berenger's ex-wife is trying, she left him because he wasn't cultured enough, and so he's trying to, like, up his culture by reading the classics, but of course he's reading, like, the 1960s comic book version of Moby Dick. It's meant to be a humorous take, because they were just these simplistic versions, whereas the new ones are indeed they are actually worthy, maybe not successors, but additions to the mythology. And so, long story short, I'm looking at the cover for the graphic novel version, and aesthetically, it's got the 1920s aesthetic to it, but you look at it, it's a pool party at Gatsby's. There's a guy playing the violin. There's people kind of lounging about as they do in Gatsby, but there's just no insight into the novel. It's purely the 1920s kind of rich dilettante aesthetic, as opposed to what the original. I wish I knew how to pronounce his name, Cugat. I'll have to look it up. That painting, there's so much to talk about there that my students and I end up talking about that at least for almost one whole class period.
Yeah.
And I feel like any later editions have just lacked what that one just intrinsically has.
Yeah, because I mean, like you said, I do technically, because I like the story so much, I'll pretty much appreciate any cover art.
Yeah.
But I'm looking at some of the examples, including the most recent one, the graphic novel one, but
Yep.
some of them, and all of them, are reflections of their own individual time period. And so technically we could probably make a podcast, just Great Gatsby cover art, the podcast, and cover each one of them, no pun intended, to decide what they say about each era, because you can see the ones from the 80s where it looks like the same kind of covers like Sweet Valley High or the Babysitter's Club, like those very, realistic image, portraiture kind of things, or like those images, where there's some that are, from the 30s or the 40s, which are Art Deco in their own way, not that this one is, this is the definition of Art Deco, but and then there's the ones that every time it comes out in movie form, including the most recent movie, they have just the movie poster as the cover art. So that's very clear that they're just trying to demonstrate that the story is still relevant, and look, they keep making it into Hollywood pictures, so you should like it. But to me, this one is so incredible because of the story behind it. It's not as simple as somebody said, all right, give me the gist of the story and I'll draw you up a picture, or the luxury that the other artists have had is that as time goes on, this thing has become much more the classic piece of literature, and so they have so much more to work with as far as, all right, this story, so let me just paint a picture on the cover of the book so this is the right one. In some versions, F. Scott Fitzgerald's name is bigger than the title. So then it is. But so anyway, this one, the first question with any primary source, and what we're trying to figure out, is what does this tell us about mid-1920s American society, culture, economics? This is the very reason why the book itself is chosen in so many high school settings to read, because it is a perfect primary source of 100 years ago. It's an ultimate 1920s thing. So what material is this made from? And the paint, the canvas, the paper, all that stuff, that's of course to be understood as that's part of the material. But in this case, it's the book itself, the story itself is part of the material. And one of the things that the artist Cugat had at his disposal was, and he wasn't a book designer by trade. He was a graphic artist, but he wasn't somebody that made a career. This is the only book cover he ever did. Before or after. And he has this story that he gets into. He starts reading on the Ash Heaps of Millionaires, which was one of the original titles that Fitzgerald was working with, and he starts to paint elements of it. So it's definitely a woman's face hovering over a city skyline with the lights, and you can see what looks like a tear, but it's actually a green light, which is a major component of the story itself. And most people superficially just assume that this is a nod to and a very important component to the story, which is the aging, weather-torn billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which are two eyes looking through spectacles, the eyes of God. So if any high schoolers are listening to this as they're trying to read The Great Gatsby and get the meaning of it, we just kind of gave away the imagery. But there are some who believe, and actually it's pretty well stated, that Fitzgerald saw the early renditions of Celestial Eyes, and that's what actually put the billboard of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg into the book. Is that something you've heard as well?
Yeah, that's you mentioned before we started recording that you try not to do too much research, so it's a genuine conversation. I try to do the same, but unfortunately, as I teach this novel every year, I'm constantly bringing this stuff up, and I've seen multiple sources where they talk about this, that the painting was created before the novel was finished, and that Fitzgerald, when he wrote this, he painstakingly wrote this and went through multiple drafts. and things changed, and it's pretty well confirmed that the art was done and he had previewed it, and then the book went through some changes. And of course, like, there's no like Fitzgerald commentary, like, yes, I changed this because, but it does seem to be that like the art itself reflected what the novel was, but the novel also kind of was shaped and reflected by this piece of art. Which, like you mentioned before, it's not the normal process. The normal process is a book goes out, it goes to the publishing company, and they edit it, and then they hire someone to do a cover. They have an in-house person who does covers. I actually found a couple of years ago when I did this, I found an article on Vox that was kind of just like acknowledging the iconic nature of this cover, and then kind of looking at like how do you go about redesigning this, because that's what ends up happening when you contract out, that eventually the publishing company loses rights to that cover. They need to update it, and there's an urge for them to update just so to get more bookstores to buy it, maybe update it for the era so more people will buy it because it reflects the aesthetic of the time. And looking at those other covers, and I've just now pulled up just a whole host of them. They just like you mentioned before, that they're reflective of when they're made, and the art style, the art material. But none of them really are able to capture much more than like the grill of the car. There's one with Gatsby wearing one of those kind of 1920s hats, and it says F. Scott Fitzgerald on the top, and we don't actually see his face. I think the most recent one I found is a kind of a gatefold cover that looks. It's got the green light on one of the inserts. It's got the Great Gatsby written almost kind of looking like buildings and gardens. And then on the back is a tipped over a champagne glass and a martini glass still standing up.
So those more recent ones have so much more. It seems like they're having a lot of fun with it.
Yeah.
I remember you turning me on to some posters a couple years ago. There's a poster maker, and I'm sure you know the name, I don't, but there's a particular movie theater, I think in Austin, Texas. They show older movies, classic movies, modern classics, and they have a graphic artist who comes in and reimagines the posters, and a lot of them are very Art Deco in their design, and so it adds a fun. He probably has a great time thinking about what can I do with these movies. And in the same token, I think a lot of the modern cover artists are probably saying, what can I do with the Great Gatsby? It can't obviously just take the Celestial Eyes one and just redo that.
His can't redo it.
So let me find other themes from the story and illustrate that, or what are the aspects that the reader, the audience I'm going after, what would they get the most out of? What all this tells me about 1920s America is just what a meeting place that time period was of so much media. That it was really the birth of the mass media as we know it.
Certainly.
You have, because both the author and the illustrator were born within just a few years of each other. So they're in the same exact generation. They're from two totally different backgrounds. Fitzgerald is American, whereas Cugat is Spanish, and had moved around quite a bit in his early life and settled down in New York right around the same time that Fitzgerald did to get into this world. But such an arrival, such like a nexus almost of everything from visual arts, from still images when it comes to paintings or portraiture. Motion pictures were on the rise and they were developing. And you have, in this case, writers who are, and so much of this is a direct impact of the First World War.
Certainly.
Comes into the story itself, but this lost generation artists and writers and illustrators and just, everybody there, but also the fact that the United States, our entire economy, unlike most of Western Europe, was largely intact after the First World War. There was some reorganization going on, but it was really unlike that of Britain and France and definitely Germany, not suffering and not reeling to the same degree as those. And so the United States was ready to really open up this new age. And that's where we're all here. So you have basically a story underway. he gets inspired by it. He starts painting this painting inspired by the story, which then reverses itself, and the rest of the rewrites get inspired by. I mean, talk about just, it's like holding up two mirrors to each other. Just endless supply of stuff, and that really that paints a picture of the time period. Now, who likely made it, and we know who made it. It was, like I said, it was Francisco Cugat. I'm sure I'm not saying it right. He's Spanish, so I'm making that the G sound not quite a hard G the same way. Maxwell Perkins was the publisher of the book, and he had a number of, he's just as symbolic of the time period as the writers that he worked with, and he referred to this as a masterpiece for the book. In a letter to Fitzgerald. And the maker's status in society. We can answer this one at the same time and see what it tells us.
Yeah.
So Cugat was a graphic artist. He was a portrait painter. He came from a very creative family in Spain. He had moved around some. He had gone from Spain to Cuba in 1903. Worked as a portrait artist in Paris, in South America, and Cuba, so very well traveled. He moves to the United States in early 1920, around 1920, and is recognized for his talents in Chicago. And there he was painting opera cards for the Chicago opera houses and so forth. And then he eventually works his way over to New York, where he starts his work with the graphic design for things like some early films. Eventually, he moves out to Hollywood. So actually in 1925, right after The Great Gatsby comes out, he moves out to Hollywood. And by the 1940s, he had become a consultant with a lot of the well, even before that, throughout the 20s, he had done some work for doing set design for a lot of movies, and especially ones that were set in South America or in Spain. So he had a particular eye for detail when it came to how those should look. But I would say that somebody who is in the visual arts definitely was having an elevated status throughout the 1920s. That if you had a talent for being able to put images out there, make them look exciting and vibrant and eye-catching, this was definitely an age for you. So the 1920s were all about being seen and being recognized, being seen. And as somebody such as yourself who works so much with visual arts, do you seem to trace, again, I mean, I'm just full of puns that I don't even mean to trace the drawing and the painting arts and just basically graphic design. Would you say the 20s is kind of like the birth of that era?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's the birth of the way we look at it. Sure. I think the graphic design, I mean, you could argue, I mean, we could do a whole other podcast where we talk about the kind of the origin of graphic design. I teach a class about comic books and graphic storytelling, and we talk about kind of, yes, you can look at the comic strips of the 1890s or so, and then all the way through the 1920s, and talk about, oh, that's the origin of comics. But you can date it even further back. The first class, we literally talk about the Lascaux caves and things like that. And so, like, I think in one sense you're absolutely right that the 1920s, in terms of graphics design and that meeting point between different mediums and genres and things like that, really, as far as we understand it, it dates back to the 20s. And as an English teacher, I look at it, the 1920s is such a special era because there's a global connection that, like, you can connect to World War I, you can connect it to the stock booms in the 20s, and eventually the crash and the depression, the Dust Bowl, and all this stuff. All these things kind of swirl together to get this interconnectivity between different mediums of art and expression. Like we have all these American expatriates who are floating around Europe and France and Spain, meeting these artists who, you know, like Cugat or however you pronounce his name.
Francis C.
Yeah, old Francis C. There you go. So
C.
It's funny to even think about how it's a chicken or the egg, like what came first, what influenced what on the macro level, just all these artists and writers and musicians, and on the micro level of of Gatsby itself. You know, like if you look at Fitzgerald himself and his history, clearly his own experiences are just littered throughout Gatsby, right? Yeah. Like it really is a semi-autobiographical look at himself, his own experiences, his own anxieties. But it's also clear that there was some connection between this piece of art and where the story eventually like went. And so I think that's one of the reasons why I regard this cover so highly. It's not just about Gatsby and its connection to that. It's also so indicative of the time where, yeah, the art style does reflect the 1920s, but there's more to it than that. That there's such a historical connection between all these things. And I think after this podcast, I'm going to go and I'm going to look at the other covers for other books of the time, you know, Hemingway and things like that, because I feel like there's something there that is just important. You know, that like it's so reflective.
Yeah, I mean, I did look up cover art for some of Fitzgerald's cronies like Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms. Yeah, their cover art, and I don't know if it was just the quick sampling that I took, but their cover art it looks nothing like this one. It's very simple, and I mean this one's simple too, but it's also involved. I mean, but it's just like.
But I mean, sorry, God.
It's not quite the same. For some reason, this one does separate itself so much more.
Yeah,
because of its. I don't know, just something about it. It draws you in. It's whereas the other ones really don't. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, there's, you know, a guy on the cover of the book, and you know even the previous one, Fitzgerald's big, you know, his first book in 1920, This Side of Paradise.
Yep,
has a very simple, you know, very just kind of narrative. You know, like here's a man and a lady, and
yeah, and well, that's. You know, that's why I was saying that this cover is so special, because I think those covers reflect the art of the time and the basic, you know, kind of feel of the time, I guess.
Yeah.
And like, especially if you look at Hemingway's, you're just like, oh, that makes sense, right? Like the Hemingway is this no proof writer, like literally has these short, choppy sentences, and you look at the art, you're like, oh, okay, so it's just like a basic pastiche of the novel. Yeah. There's no deeper connection there. It's like, oh, Sun Also Rises with some basic imagery
there you go.
Yeah, here you go. Whereas maybe it's because of how personal Gatsby was to Fitzgerald that they felt, you know, comfortable getting an outside artist to like create an actual piece of art. Yeah. Or, you know, I would love. I have so many days where I'm like, I wish I had a time machine and a Harry Potter-esque invisibility cloak, just so I could fly on the wall, see these conversations. I'm sure more often than not, I would just be disappointed, you know, like
I've been working on my time machine in my garage for a while, missing a few parts, but you know, I'm
Flux
sure we
capacitor.
can find a way. Yeah. If you work on the invisibility cloak, I'll work on the time machine. We'll go.
Well, I've always loved, you know, time travel movies and stuff like that. But I've always in the back of my head been like, there's no way that I'm going to meet like Teddy Roosevelt and he's going to live up to the character I've created in my mind. You know, like that he's just going to be a letdown. There was actually, I think it was a TV show on Fox a couple of years ago called Making History. And the premise was a moron creates time travel and is traveling back to the Revolutionary era. And every single person is just a disappointment. They're all like just as dumb as we are, just as like, you know, brutish and stupid as we are. It's just over time their legend
it's been built up so much.
Yeah.
Well, I think about with this one specifically though, the Woody Allen movie Midnight in Paris really does actually go directly towards this, because you have a character that is just he's bored, he's a writer, and he's like, you know, I wish I could live in a time, and he goes back to the 20s.
Yeah.
And meets these expatriate writers, and he's excited to be there, and they're all saying, oh God, I wish I could go back to 30 years before and, you know, see what things were like back in the 1890s. That's when, you know, this city was coming alive, and that's when our craft was at its height. And it's that idea. I mean, look at the last words in The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
I mean, that says it all right there, is that we're always looking back to previous time periods for inspiration, and we can't just let go of the past. Like, it's all about the past. So maybe you and I here almost 100 years later are heeding his words exactly, be like, this
certainly
is the only book cover that matters. All the other ones are garbage. This one, well, not garbage, but this one is the book cover. But I mean, I think that's part of the answer to the next question. Why did they make it? I think they knew how special this story was before it went into press, and that's why this special care went into, you have this very well recognized and respected graphic artist, this painter, comes in and makes this one. It's it's almost as if you asked, I don't know if I want to put him at the same level as Michelangelo, but how many cathedral walls was he painting? He just the one, because it's like, it's something special. But ultimately the reason why they made it was to help sell it, right? They wanted to sell the book, that it wasn't just, one day a bunch of high school kids are going to have to read this, and we want to make it look,
so class it up,
so they don't lose it, right? So they can tell the difference between this one and the other books that they have to read. This was about sales. It was all about selling it, which I tried to find the numbers, and it looked like right after it came out, somewhere by the end of the decade, it was close to 3.7 million copies of The Great Gatsby sold. So what does that tell you about the 1920s, that they would be willing to go to such lengths of hiring a professional artist to make this cover art? What does that tell you about the book market in that time period?
Well, so like, I have a bunch of things to say. Number one, going back just briefly to our talk about time travel, and that just basic human desire to look backwards more fondly maybe than we should. I think that is one of the reasons why this cover art is so iconic. That's clearly a big part of the book. But looking at the cover art itself, it's somehow like, I know when it came out, but even when it came out, it had that aesthetic of looking back with fondness, almost through like tear covered eyes, that everything's kind of watery, and then there's a fondness to it, but there's also a message there. And so, I look at, I think if I recall correctly, Gatsby wasn't a runaway success when it was first published. That, it was a tougher sell for people, with there's a murder and there's crime and things like that, which were not in vogue at the time. And so, like, looking at how many it eventually sold, its resurgence, I think that it speaks to a couple things. Number one, that we were a much more literate society. I think because there weren't as many, avenues for entertainment as there are now. I really, because I'm a comic book fan, I think I hear more of this, that I think that the public perception is, these creators, they're these, fat cats who they sold a book and they're just top of the game, whatever. But it's so much harder now for a single writer of whatever, or artist to make a mark, because there are so many more avenues, like social media alone, my Instagram, I have the usual family and friends up there, but most of my Instagram is just artists I like. And a lot of them don't even really work in comics all that much. They just put their stuff on social media, and they get a buzz going, and then they sell it on their websites, which is it's a great way to make money. That's awesome. But like, I think that you look back at Fitzgerald's era, and I think part of those book sales numbers speak to kind of the desire for our culture to be entertained, as well as this, there were movies, but they weren't, nearly as revered or ubiquitous as they are now.
And movies find themselves in the book briefly. They mention about, in the hottest day of the year, going to see a movie and just escaping the heat, and they poo-poo that idea, but it's
almost like a novelty to them.
Right. Well, I mean, it's an acknowledgement that that was an option, that
there was,
exactly, a way to be entertained other than just, it's either reading or nothing, but we can use this to because I think that goes hand in hand. And one of the other questions is, who is the intended audience? And you mentioned this. there was a growing readership. I looked at some numbers because I find that books in particular, or newspapers, circulation of any kind of printed material, text, has to acknowledge that people can read,
Yeah.
because those are the two things that you need. One of the two things that you need in order to have a book industry or any kind of print culture is to have a population that can read and has the time to read,
And has the money to read as well.
right? In this case, to
income.
buy the book instead of just going to the library and hoping that there are one or two copies is available. So in 1910, 8% of the population above the age of 10 was illiterate. So 92% of teenagers and adults were literate. And then by 1930, there's only 4% of the population is illiterate. So it's gone up to 96%, thanks mostly to this book, I imagine. Everybody learned to read, sitting around reading Gatsby. But I think that what all this says, like you've mentioned already about the time period, is that people had more time and they had more money. And this all goes back to a number of things, including continuous automation of the society, electricity. I mean, there's electricity on this book cover. You can see that electric light just glowing. And electric light also extended the daytime and your ability to read. So, reading hours weren't just up until when the sun went down. The pattern of people's days was changing quite a bit. I tell my students, as a history teacher, I say, whenever I introduce the 1920s to them, I always point out, I said, if you went again back in time with the time machine I'm working on and found yourself in the 1920s, you'd probably get along okay. That you would understand the lingo, you would be able to, the infrastructure of the country was coming together. There were telephone lines going up and down next to paved roads that were getting better and more car conducive. There was the subway systems and the train systems had been around for a long time. All this would be very familiar to us, not to mention the music, the jokes, the senses of humor. All these things were very much the origin. The 20s were the first modern era, really. And but it still shows us that books factored in as a major player in people's entertainment and interests, that they weren't just content with having a screen on, because if you wanted to watch a screen, you had to go somewhere to do that. Very few people had their own movie theaters in their house. Only the ultra rich, only the Buchanan types might have something like that, a screening room in their house. So is that something that you also read from the fact that they made it to sell, so that you would pick Gatsby and not another book, on the same, whatever other Fitzgerald or on the letter F section? That's another thing too. I wonder if bookstores, if they've, because they don't organize themselves the same way as a library. My librarian wife used to say that oftentimes people would come into the library in this age where bookstores, like those big bookstores like Barnes and Noble, have been existing for most of our lives, that they come in, they're like, well, where's the, this section, or where's that section? And she's like, well, we organize things by the Dewey Decimal System here, not by the topic necessarily. I mean, it goes by topic, but it's not. Whereas bookstores, they tend to have, like, they have those tables where they set up special, and libraries do that too. And I'm sure libraries do that as a reaction to bookstores, as a way to, they set up their special display areas so that to replicate the experience. But ultimately, the stacks of books all around the library are not organized the same way that a bookstore would be. And because there's an exchange of money that the bookstore is trying to sell these things so they can keep their lights on, and so forth and so on. So do you feel the same way, that the reason why they put so much into getting this book to have this cover that it does, does that tell you something about people's spending power of the era?
So I mean, like you said, if being a student of history, you can never acknowledge there's never one, it's 1,000 different. And so I think that the part of it is the money, the time. I think a big part of it is like I talk about my students that the kind of driving thrust behind Romanticism was this idea of escapist literature, getting out of these crowded, dirty cities that came up out of the Age of Reason, out into the wilderness, to romantic lives they just couldn't afford to or didn't have the ability to live. That we're kind of distant from reality. And so I look at the 1920s, and you've got a culture with all this time on their hands, all this money kind of flowing in. You've got greater literacy, but you've also got a time where people are looking to be entertained, and people are also looking to maybe distance themselves from the realities of World War One, and some of the kind of the dirty edges of that boom era. And so I think all of these things kind of swirl together to create such a demand for entertainment, for media, for distractions, for ways to escape the mundane. Look at the Great Depression. Look at the obsession with celebrity, and lurid criminal tales during the 1920s, late 20s and early 30s. Like John Dillinger was a direct, was directly affected by this, and the perception of him and Bonnie and Clyde and all these people was directly affected by the downtrodden nature of America and the need for those good stories, and also to some extent the need for newspapers to sensationalize those and create heroes out of just bad people. And I think that's that desire to be entertained and have a story. I don't want to be self-centered, but I think it is uniquely American to just that desire to have a story. Like what is going on there?
I mean, that's one of the themes of Gatsby itself. Between the two eggs, that the West egg is the Americans, it's the Midwesterners, it's the people that made America the way that it had by that point, and the East eggs are all the old money. They're the English infused society. They're basically the old world, and you're absolutely right about that. I think that it's and this particular painting, Celestial Eyes, has so much. I think it has a lot more of a relationship in that. You mentioned about how by the 30s people were looking for stories in their newspapers about these larger than life figures, or making them larger than life because of their media exposure. And isn't that really, I mean, this book, and just the way that it's portrayed and the way it communicates itself just by its cover art makes it difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction. That it looks like, and the story itself could easily find itself in the sensational newspapers of the era into the 1930s. And so it's almost like, I mean, that's one of the commentaries that Fitzgerald makes with the book, but by having such the cover art that it does, that informed his story potentially, and his story informing and influencing so many other people's understandings of things, it's like a cycle. It just really is very cyclical in the way it all works out, which corresponds and correlates perfectly with the growing mass media of the 20s and the 30s. I mean, the 30s, it was a Great Depression era, but it didn't slow down. My last podcast was about episode was about a movie that came out at the end of the 1930s, and there's a reason why it's the golden age of Hollywood. It was the mass media, particularly the visual media, was becoming so in high demand and therefore in high supply, and people were just finding the differentiation between fact and fiction that much harder to do a lot of times. So this is a very iconic of the era item, and I'm glad that we're talking about it so deeply. The next one is, what ideas or behavior does this convey? And with visual art like a painting, that is what they're trying to do, is convey a lot of messages in one piece of artwork. So in this case, it's a painting of a woman's eyes. Inside of her eyes are two female nudes in poses. And so it's, and that's something that definitely like a subliminal message sent by the painter that says so much right there. But then like I mentioned before about the way that it has elements of the story, like the green light, the green light of envy, is also a tear. Are these Daisy's eyes? And by extension, is this Zelda? So this is like the original Legend of Zelda. Is this painting? Do you think that the artist was trying to paint a specific character from the story, or was he just taking the look of a woman's face from the era and superimposing it over the city?
I think the answer is somewhere in between. Um, so like, I think part of it is the aesthetic, the flapper girl. That it's this beautiful yet ultimately empty woman. Whether that be Zelda or I unfortunately I can't think of the woman that it's just failing me because of the hour, I guess. The woman that Fitzgerald was originally obsessed with. I think a lot of this kind of all swirls together to kind of create this figure that can be all things, that can be reflective of the time, that can be reflective of individual characters in the book, or of kind of the insights that Fitzgerald has. And maybe that's why it's so successful is
Yeah.
It can be so many things, so many different people. I even look at the lights on it, the green light as a teardrop, it's so metaphorical. But like, if you look at the cover, the lights at the bottom, you're looking at them, they can be so many different things. They can be a city. It almost looks like if you see a fair or a circus or an amusement park in the distance. Exactly. And so like you can read into it what you want, right? Is this, like mirage-like illusion of a beautiful city unfolding before you? Is it this amusement park for adults? Or is it something slightly more sinister? There's lots of reds and yellows in there. Which are typically seen as not comforting colors.
Some of the early drafts have much more of like a doom and gloom look to it, like a Valley
of the Ashes
kind of look to it.
Yeah,
and I think that he's like, well, I don't necessarily have to draw, paint that. I can paint.
Yep.
The whole book is about superficialities. So he paints something that on the surface looks straightforward. Oh yeah, that's a city. But when you start, especially on the left side where you have what looks like a Ferris wheel.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's very much like, oh yeah, maybe it's not actually a amusement park, it's a city, but isn't the city for these people in the age group that they're, like an amusement park for them.
Exactly.
Constantly. So yeah, absolutely. And it's almost, so when it comes to the behaviors and ideas, it's almost like the artist, Francis Cugat, was like, thank you for painting or for writing such a illustrative book with so much depth in its simplicity. The book is not super long.
No,
it's not incredibly. I think that and I'll include myself in this. When I was in high school and I read it, this was one of the first books that I really understood symbolism. I really, was able to wrap my head around the way that he uses everything from geography to technology to get across a larger idea. And I felt like I was like, yes, like great success. Like, this is like awesome. I never actually said great success when I was in 11th grade, but the idea was just like, it was almost like a lob and you hit a home run. It's like you didn't hit a home run off a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, but you still hit a home run.
Exactly.
By cracking the code. Cracking the egg. But so it's almost like when he took on this project of painting the cover art, he was like, thank you, because now I get to do an equally seemingly simple picture, but just totally full of, because it's a seemingly simple story.
Yeah.
But it becomes, the more you read it, and the second time you read it, the third time you read it, just the layers of it. And this also has layers to it.
Well, that's, in schools and public education, we're always talking about, how to innovate, how to grow with the times, what should we leave behind, what should we hang on to. And there's this big thrust to like, just let the kids read what they want to read, or just read modern stuff. And I do lend credit to that. Like, you do always want to kind of keep growing and be open to change. But I look at Gatsby and I look at the cover of this, and one of the reasons I keep fighting for it is, like you said, this is, for a lot of kids, this is the first time where they read something and it clicks. maybe not because they identify with Gatsby or they identify with any characters in there, but it's such a perfect application of what literature can be, where it doesn't need to be, as much as I love Moby Dick, it doesn't need to be 400 pages of omniscient narrator giving me the history of every single island we pass by, and kind of beating me over the head. I love Moby Dick, but you look at Gatsby and it's almost frustrating because I know it was not effortless, that he poured in so much of his soul into the drafts of this, but it feels effortless. Like watching, I go back and watch some of the old musicals, Bing Crosby and those guys, and see them sing and dance, and it almost feels like a camera just happened to be on when this effortless thing happened. And that's the feeling I get when I read Gatsby, and even like look at the cover, that culturally it's so significant because it feels so much more effortless, and that it has so many layers and so many ways to look at it and so many things you can talk about it. And I'm sure part of that is just who Fitzgerald was, and knowing his history just adds depth to it. But nothing, not nothing. I want to be careful not to be a cranky old man, but so little of what comes out now takes a lesson from that either you're beat over the head with symbolism or metaphor, or it is just superficial storytelling where things happen. I do some creative writing in my classes, particularly my comic book class. And I talk about how so many writers get stuck in this trap of, and then, like something cool happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens. And there's no connective tissue between it. Whereas like what you're saying with Gatsby, everything swirls together into something more. There's so much depth to it. I think that speaks to the art as well. Maybe because of the art.
And it's funny because this painting is part of that connective tissue. And it's interesting because there's no tissue visible, right? I mean, you don't see actual skin on this, as far as, the face itself is not connected to anything. But I mean, what a perfect thing for, man, it just hit me actually looking at this. I'm like, so you're first encountered with a face, and what's behind a face in, the human anatomy is the brain. And so it's almost empty. Like the book itself is the brain, and the face is, just holding it all in. And just as soon as you open up the cover, you're like, welcome to, my mind. This is everything that's been going on. And he definitely was, I mean, this is 1920s pop culture. And as far as like which contributed to the writing of the book, because it's set in the 20s, it's not set in any other time period. It's real time. I think it was in 1922 that the story takes place, and then the book, he writes it and published in 25, so it's contemporary. It is pop culture, and I don't think he had any illusions, and that includes why this particular designer was asked to paint it, that it was going to become popular. He went with a big time publisher to get this done. And just to backtrack to, I mean, there's really no order to the questions, but I just want to bring this one up. Where was it made? It was made entirely in New York, and it's about New York. The whole, I mean, the 20s equals New York. I mean, New York is the centerpiece of, you can't get any further east than New York, but it's the centerpiece of the whole country. And it just epitomizes the 20s so much. And the other part is what locations are associated with this source, and it's nationwide. Everyone around the country, around the world, had access to this almost immediately. And a couple of things that tells us, one, New York City, our understanding of New York City as being this center of the Western world, the new Rome, is something that really didn't start taking shape until about 100 years before this book came out. That around the time of the end of the Revolutionary War and into the early 19th century, Philadelphia was the bigger city. Philadelphia had a lot more sway. That's why Philadelphia served as the capital. Well, New York did for a time too, but it was the building of the Erie Canal that really transformed New York into becoming 100, well before 100 years later, but by 100 years later, that's why the financial, capital of the country was at the mouth, the meeting place between Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes was by way of the canal. That's where the money exchanged, and that's what a perfect place to have a publishing industry because the books are going to be written, and even if they're not written in New York itself, but this one was, even if they're not, New York isn't the actual setting, but they're going to be edited, they're going to be published, they're going to have all the marketing coming out of New York, and then it is just going to explode out to the rest of the country. And
Yep.
it can only do that with a growing road network and infrastructure.
Yep.
Yeah, so you have, the canal days have long since been gone by. The railroads were still very much prominent. I mean, that's something, one of the greatest achievements of the Transcontinental Railroad completion 50 some odd years before was that it connected the country culturally, that you could read a book in San Francisco that came from New York and get the same ideas as somebody else. It wasn't something like you had only regional books and things like that. And so people started to, like I said before, understand the same language, talk, the same way, have references. You and I are making this podcast about this particular book cover, and it's not going to be just somebody close by that knows of it. It's world over has had access to this. So it really, the reason that it was even made in the first place in New York, and the fact that it got such widespread distribution because of it, says so much about the growing network of roads and railroads that the 1920s, I mean, it's by no coincidence, but end of that decade, you had the US highway system had been formulated, and Congress was spending money putting together a organized way that cars and trucks and everything else could drive around the entire network of roads throughout the country, and alleviate the traffic and make it much safer, something that was going to become even more defined about 30 years later with the interstate highways. I went off the deep end there, but just to bring it home. So anyway, cars do play a role in the Great Gatsby too. So the last question is this prescriptive, as in, is it trying to make you think a certain way or do something, or is it descriptive? And for this particular piece of artwork, I think we've mentioned it a few times, but it's definitely both, because well, with any kind of marketing, you want somebody to think a certain way, and they literally want you to judge a book by its cover. I mean, that's the idea.
Exactly.
Here. If they didn't want you to know anything about what was in the book, they would just leave the cover blank. The dust jacket would be torn off. They wouldn't even just bother with it. So it is prescriptive in that we want you to be drawn into this book. You want to read it so that the cover will make sense. But do you think it is in fact descriptive as well? I mean, it's a modern art piece, so it's not easy to crack. It's not like some of the other cover arts where it's like, here's this, the Great Gatsby is standing next to an automobile. Like,
well, that's like one of the elements to the boom in literacy and literature are pulp novels. The early 1910s through 1920s. Which for a lot of Americans, that was it was seen as low entertainment. Though if you go and read some of those, it's not low. I mean, the subject material is in often cases low entertainment, but the writing, Edgar Rice Burroughs, it's where he got his start. The majority of his novels kind of fall into that pulp kind of genre. But if you look at the covers to those, a lot of them they're crass. They're designed to be just like attract people because it's got beautiful women and dangerous scenarios and stuff like that. Whereas Gatsby, it is both. It reflects both sides of that, because there was such a connection between artist and material and writer, and kind of that flow back and forth, that it works as a way to kind of look into the novel and be reflective of that, but also kind of to almost, it feels like, control where the novel went, and interact with the reader themselves. And that's all great art. That's what it does. It tells a story. It reflects who created it, the time in which they created it, the subject material, but also creates a discussion within the viewer, and creates emotions within the viewer. And I think that this, contrary to what most art or cover art is, this one does exactly that.
And it came together so organically too, which I think says so much about how this age was the beginning of all this. I mean, my point of reference for most of the publishing world comes entirely from the movie Elf, where you get to see the inside of how they make children's books. And I do know a bit more about the publishing industry beyond that too. But my understanding, like you were mentioning before, is that a lot of times it does reflect any other corporation, where it's like, we have this department, the art department will take care of this, and then the editing department will do that. And there's really not that kind of, we like to think that there is a lot more synergy in companies in the modern era, but a lot of it, you can have an entire picture book done where the artist will never meet the illustrator.
Exactly.
No communication, that the illustrator just gets an assigned, you kind of picture them as sitting side by side in a nice little rustic, cabin in the countryside somewhere, and let's write our book together. And as the writer is, on an old typewriter tapping away, you have the illustrator painting, and yes, this is, but it's nothing like that. It's very much, very machine-like in some ways. It's like production, where they just get these contracts out. But with this one, because it was in the opening stages of what would eventually develop into what I just described, as the opening stages of it, so much more organic, that it's like the first time around with something like this, it's going to be the best one, where it wasn't just, all right, go down the hall and get old Frankie C, he's our best illustrator, he's going to
whip something up,
your book with the eyes and stuff, that he's going to come up, he's going to work that up.
Well, that's how you get covers with just like the grill to Gatsby's car, which it's a part of the novels, to be certain, but it's not. There isn't a conversation there. There's not depth. It's just it's like if you see covers to the DVD version of Jaws, you have the iconic picture, and like some have the original poster where it's the deep water and the below it, but like some of them are just like it's like a fin. Occasionally, I do like this is such a weird avenue to go down, but I do like to look at cover art for like DVDs and stuff like that when they're released in other countries. The translations are always kind of funny or weird or idiosyncratic, or in some cases like better. But the art they choose to use, because I think there's licensing issues. The art they choose to use is not always the art that is on the American or Western world versions, and sometimes there's some brilliance there, but other times it really is just like we took an element of it and we just slapped it on the box. I mean,
I'm gonna give a shout out to one of my favorite YouTubers, a guy named Minty, who does he does his top 10 things you didn't know about, and he usually does movies. And one of a regular feature that he'll do is he'll bring up posters of or DVD covers from the international. Most of the movies he reviews are from the United States, and so he'll show what it looked like when it came out in Japan, or how it came out in Germany and Italy, and some of them, like you said, sometimes it's better. Other times he'll point out, he's like, I don't know why they're focusing on this particular character or element and making that the centerpiece of the painting, but again, that's a primary source of that time and place. That the audiences in that country in that time period were maybe more interested in whatever character from Uncle Buck that they chose to make as the center.
Macaulay Culkin becomes the star of Uncle Buck.
Well, they did that for My Girl.
They certainly did,
in a big way, and I can't believe that has come up into my podcast more than a couple times already. But yeah, they really, the way they marketed that movie was coming off of Home Alone. They're like, well, this is basically another Macaulay Culkin movie, even though he's not the main character. He's an important character, but he's not the main one.
He's much more of a plot device than anything else.
Going back to the book covers, though, we were talking about this, and I've seen, so there's a famous set of photographs. I mean, he wrote his own book called How the Other Half Lives, Jacob Riis. His 1890s lecture turned photographic journal in a book, where it's that famous photograph of an alley in Skid Row, where you see all these various characters, kind of figures standing off and looking at different phases of up to no goodism, kind
Yeah.
of looking back at the camera. And so that was incorporated into his book, so it makes sense when that is on the cover of different versions of that book. But I've seen
Yeah.
that same photograph used for the Gangs of New York,
Oh
which
yeah.
is a book that uh, eventually inspired in some ways the Scorsese movie
Sort of.
years later. I mean, it's just a documentary chronicle of, so my copy of The Gangs of New York, the book, has that photograph on it. I've also seen
Yeah.
it on the cover of Maggie, A Girl of the Streets
Yes.
by
Yeah.
and so it's like, and the way they just kind of like, okay, so this is about 19th century, late 19th century New York. Go, just like
Yeah.
slap that picture up there. And there's really no, if the fact that you can take the same photograph and use it interchangeably between titles just kind of shows how disconnected especially with the what do you call it when everything's fair game,
Copyright laws.
when the copyright's expired and it becomes public domain and fair use, that you can just I'm sure that photograph doesn't have the copyright anymore or whatever, and they can just use it, and it just kind of peters out. But with this one in particular, it really is so much of a both prescriptive, descriptive, and shows us so much about the time period. And is there any last words that you want to say about The Great Gatsby's book cover, The Celestial Eyes?
Well, I just want to touch back just briefly what you were just talking about. Like this cover on so many fronts is the exception, not the rule. You look at the publishing aspect. The rule is no, the publishers just they get in-house artists, just slap something on it, and it really is. It's rarely that we get something like this. I was just watching The Man Who Invented Christmas about Charles Dickens writing A Christmas Carol, which I love the movie. I'm not exactly sure how factual it is. Though I know there's a book that I have yet to read that kind of covers the material, but a big part of it is he wants illustrations to the book because you kind of need those. And his publishers they just have like an average artist that they just use routinely. He's, no, it must be this person. I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? Like, there's no time to do this. He makes this big point of, no, I'm going to go make my case to this person, and it's a turning point in the movie. And I think Gatsby and the cover, I'm sure it's not as dramatic as that, but I think it is documents like this where there is care and attention, and it's so intertwined with the material, the people, the history, the demand. That's why you have this podcast to talk about stuff like that, and that's why it is a part of our national identity, a part of our global identity. This book is it's printed. I don't know how many countries, but I'm sure a very good deal of them have had access to this book, and it is iconic. It's why they keep making movies out of it, and why it's taught in so many high schools and discussed and keeps getting brought up in the national discourse. That it's the exception, not the rule. It's just a significant contribution.
It probably is one of the most hinted at or referenced in other pop culture I mean, it's a sure thing that if you reference some kind, I was just watching two of my favorite comedy shows both start with the title King of so there's the King of Queens and the King of the Hill, and I was just watching episodes of those recently where Hank Hill and King of the Hill is hoping to save up money to buy a new patio set from the Gatsby collection, and it's by the end of the episode he finally gets enough to buy two of them, including I think it's the Buchanan recliner or something like that, and it's like this 20s-esque looking thing, and then the other one is and it makes sense for the King of Queens considering that Queens is a component in the story that there's a few references to it, including one where he is unsure what it's even about because his wife Carrie really wants to read. She gets laid off, and so she is like, I finally want to do something with my life. Like, I just want to take some time for me, and I've never read The Great Gatsby. I want to read The Great Gatsby. And so later in the episode, he's like, well, I mean, the Great Gatsby's a magician, right? And she's like, well, like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, that's why he's the Great Gatsby. He's like, that's what I assume. He's like,
Yeah.
he's never read it himself.
Yeah.
But it's references like that. I mean, it's funny because they assume most of the audience either had to or on their own volition read this book. And
yeah, they're able to get that kind of low humor joke that he is
because
a lovable buffoon.
Becomes such a part of our.
Yeah.
And so just from that simple walk down the street a couple of months ago, where I took a look in the window and saw a very recent cover of this book, I said that is not the Gatsby cover that should be there.
No,
it really ought to be some version of Celestial Eyes, because it is both descriptive, prescriptive, and such a perfect symbol of the time period. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thanks for having
about
me.
this, and I hope it's not the last time, because you and I
certainly not.
Have some really great conversations, whether it be about 1989 Batman, or in this case 1925 Celestial Eyes, the cover of The Great Gatsby. So thank you again.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And for everyone listening, please check us out on all the major platforms, including Instagram, Facebook, Patreon. Just recently, if you become a Patreon patron, there is some good stuff for you. First tier, you can get a sticker. Second tier, you can offer up ideas about what you'd like to have us analyze on the show. And third tier, not only is there a t-shirt involved in that, but also you can be a guest commentator. And that's something that I find is especially helpful, because these are just great conversations that you and I would already have.
Yeah.
But we might as well put a microphone in front of us and see how it goes. So thank you for joining us on the EPS podcast, where everything, including the 1925 cover of The Great Gatsby, is a primary source. We'll talk to you next time.